after they hurt you, they don't feel nothing. They feel something far more dangerous than guilt because the moment they admit what they did, everything they believe about themselves starts to fall apart. What they feel next is hidden, rehearsed, denied, and buried so deeply that even they won't say it out loud. And once you understand this, their behavior stops being confusing and starts becoming predictable. If this is making sense so far, stay with me, because understanding this is how you stop personalizing their behavior and start reclaiming your leverage. Narcissists do experience emotional reactions after hurting someone, but those reactions are not processed through empathy or mutual awareness the way they are in healthy psychological functioning. Their internal system is organized around ego protection rather than emotional connection, which means feelings are filtered through the question of how the event affects their self-image, power, and control. When they cause pain, the first internal response is not concern for the other person, but a rapid assessment of status. Did this action increase dominance or threaten it? Did it reinforce superiority or expose weakness? Emotions arise, but they are evaluated for usefulness rather than meaning. Empathy requires the ability to mentally step outside oneself and emotionally resonate with another person's experience. Narcissistic structures lack this capacity in a stable form. Instead of feeling sadness because someone else is hurt, they feel tension because the situation might reflect badly on them. Instead of guilt, they experience irritation, defensiveness, or anxiety. These reactions are not signs of emotional emptiness, but signs of emotional misalignment. Their nervous system responds to threat, not to harm caused. Pain in others only matters insofar as it creates consequences for the narcissist. This is why their reactions often appear cold, dismissive, or confusing. They may feel something intense internally, but that intensity is about regulation, not remorse. The ego acts like a shield that redirects emotional energy away from vulnerability. Any feeling that could lead to self-examination is immediately reframed. If shame arises, it is split off or converted into anger. If fear arises, it is masked by arrogance. If doubt appears, it is replaced with certainty. The emotional experience exists, but it is rapidly edited to preserve the narrative of superiority. Because their identity depends on being right, admired, or in control. Admitting emotional responsibility would feel like psychological collapse. The ego defense system intervenes automatically. Rationalization explains away the behavior. Projection assigns blame outward. Minimization reduces the severity of the harm. These are not calculated lies in the traditional sense, but reflexive internal maneuvers designed to stabilize the self. The narcissist often believes their own justifications because believing them is necessary for emotional survival. This also explains why they can revisit the event repeatedly without ever arriving at accountability. Each internal replay is used to reinforce the defended version of reality. Emotional reactions are rehearsed and refined until they support the ego. Over time, the original feeling that briefly surfaced becomes inaccessible, buried under layers of explanation. What remains is a sense of being wronged, misunderstood, or unfairly judged. From the outside, this looks like a lack of feeling. In reality, it is an overload of unmanaged feeling that cannot be processed safely. The system prioritizes control over connection, certainty over curiosity, dominance over repair. Emotional reactions are real, but empathy is incompatible with the structure that keeps the narcissistic identity intact. So every feeling is forced through a defensive filter that reshapes it into something safer, harder, and more self-serving. reinforcing a cycle where emotion exists without understanding and impact is felt without responsibility. When a narcissist hurts someone, the immediate emotional payoff is a surge of perceived power. Causing pain produces a momentary sense of dominance because it confirms influence. In their internal framework, influence equals safety. If another person reacts, withdraws, pleads, or becomes emotionally destabilized, it signals that the narcissist still matters, still controls emotional space, still shapes outcomes. This sensation is intoxicating but extremely short-lived. It is not rooted in confidence or self-worth, but in external reaction, which means it fades as soon as the reaction does. Once that initial rush passes, the internal state becomes unstable. The nervous system that briefly felt elevated now drops into agitation. The narcissist is left without the feedback that sustained the feeling of control. This creates a subtle but persistent discomfort. They may not consciously label it as anxiety, but it manifests as restlessness, irritability, or an urge to re-engage. Silence from the person they hurt becomes intolerable because it removes the mirror they use to regulate their self-image. Without emotional input, their internal sense of self begins to wobble. This instability is not about missing the person in a relational sense. It is about losing access to a regulating stimulus. Narcissistic identity is externally anchored. It relies on attention, admiration, fear, or emotional reaction to maintain coherence. Hurting someone provides a spike of that regulation, but it also creates risk. Once harm is done, the possibility of rejection, exposure, or detachment increases. This introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty is experienced as threat. Their internal system is not built to tolerate ambiguity or loss of control, so it moves quickly to reduce that threat. As instability grows, compensatory behaviors emerge. They may justify their actions, replay conversations, or exaggerate the other person's flaws to restore a sense of moral or psychological superiority. These internal narratives are not about truth, but about balance. They are trying to return to a state where they feel dominant rather than dependent. In some cases, this leads to further provocation. If they can trigger another reaction, the system stabilizes again, at least temporarily. If they cannot, frustration escalates. This is why narcissists often oscillate between indifference and intrusion. After hurting someone, they may act detached to project control, then suddenly attempt contact to regain emotional leverage. The internal instability demands resolution. They need either reassurance that they are still powerful or confirmation that the other person remains affected. Both serve the same purpose. They reduce the discomfort created when the initial rush of dominance wears off. What appears from the outside as confidence or cruelty is actually regulation through impact. The narcissist is not sustained by hurting others, but by what hurting others momentarily provides. Once that fades, the underlying fragility resurfaces. This cycle repeats because the relief is always temporary. Power obtained through harm cannot stabilize the self for long, which is why the behavior escalates or repeats, driven not by strength but by an internal system that cannot maintain equilibrium without external disturbance. Shame does exist within narcissistic psychology, but it is not integrated into awareness the way it is in emotionally mature individuals. When a narcissist hurts someone, there is often a brief internal recognition that something has gone wrong. This recognition is not moral empathy, but a flash of self-awareness that their behavior could reflect badly on them. That moment carries shame, not because of the harm caused, but because of what the harm reveals about their limitations, insecurity, or loss of control. This feeling is deeply threatening because it challenges the grand image they rely on to function. Unlike healthy shame, which can lead to repair and accountability, narcissistic shame is fragmented and intolerable. The nervous system treats it as danger rather than information. As soon as it surfaces, the mind moves to eliminate it. This elimination happens so quickly that the narcissist may not even register the emotion consciously. The psyche splits it off, buries it, or transforms it into something less vulnerable. Anger is the most common replacement because it restores a sense of power. Contempt is another because it elevates the self above the other. These emotions act like armor, preventing shame from penetrating awareness. Because the shame cannot be held internally, it must be displaced outward. Projection becomes the primary mechanism. The narcissist assigns the uncomfortable feeling to the person they hurt, labeling them as weak, dramatic, disrespectful, or deserving. This externalization allows the narcissist to avoid the internal collapse that would occur if they acknowledged responsibility. In their mind, the problem is not what they did, but how the other person reacted. This shift is not strategic manipulation alone. It is a survival response to an emotion they cannot metabolize. Denial then reinforces this process. Events are rewritten to remove threatening details. Words are reinterpreted. Intentions are reframed. The narcissist constructs a version of reality where they remain justified and superior. Over time, this narrative hardens. The original moment of shame becomes inaccessible, locked behind layers of rationalization. If confronted later, they may genuinely believe their revised story because remembering the truth would reintroduce the unbearable emotion. This is why accountability feels impossible with narcissistic individuals. Admitting fault would require sustained contact with shame, and sustained contact would destabilize their identity. Their self-image is not flexible enough to absorb imperfection. It must remain intact at all costs. The psyche therefore prioritizes protection over growth. Any feedback that threatens the ego is treated as an attack rather than an opportunity for insight. What remains after suppression is not peace, but a low-level vigilance. The buried shame does not disappear completely. It becomes sensitivity to criticism, defensiveness, and an exaggerated need to be right. The narcissist may react intensely to minor challenges because those challenges risk activating what has been suppressed. The shame exists, but only as a shadow, shaping behavior from underneath awareness, influencing reactions without ever being acknowledged, admitted, or resolved. Narcissists fear exposure more than they fear loss because loss can be reframed, but exposure threatens the structure that holds their identity together. Losing a person, a relationship, or even status can be explained away as betrayal, misunderstanding, or inevitability. Exposure, however, removes their ability to control the story. It reveals inconsistencies between who they claim to be and how they actually behave. This discrepancy is not just uncomfortable, it is destabilizing. Their self-image depends on coherence, superiority, and control, and exposure fractures all three at once. When they hurt someone, the risk is not that the person leaves, but that the person sees clearly. Being seen clearly means their tactics, motives, and insecurities are no longer hidden. This is why narcissists often react more intensely when confronted with facts than when faced with separation. A breakup can be spun into a narrative of victimhood or dismissal. A clear confrontation backed by evidence threatens to collapse the illusion. That collapse feels like annihilation because their identity is externally constructed and constantly defended. Denial becomes the first line of defense. It is not simple lying, but an internal refusal to allow certain information to register. If an event contradicts their self-image, it is mentally rejected or altered. They may insist something never happened or that it happened differently. Not because they are consciously deceiving, but because accepting the truth would force self-examination. Their nervous system interprets that examination as danger, so the mind blocks access. Rewriting events follows denial. Conversations are reconstructed with altered tones, missing details, or reversed roles. The narcissist becomes the one who was provoked, misunderstood, or attacked. The person who was hurt becomes unreasonable or malicious. This rewriting serves a critical function. It restores internal order. It allows the narcissist to feel justified and superior again. The revised story is repeated internally until it feels real. Over time, memory itself adapts to the narrative that offers the most protection. This is why accountability is often met with confusion, rage, or mockery. Being asked to acknowledge harm is not heard as a request for repair, but as an attempt to expose. Exposure implies vulnerability, and vulnerability implies loss of control. The narcissist responds by doubling down on defenses. They may escalate blame, change the subject, or attack the credibility of the person confronting them. The goal is not resolution, but containment of threat. Fear of exposure also explains their obsession with image management. They may appear unconcerned about emotional bonds, yet hyper-focused on reputation, perception, and narrative dominance. What others think matters because it reinforces the mask. As long as the mask holds, losses can be tolerated. Relationships are replaceable. Truth is not. Truth threatens to reveal the emptiness or insecurity beneath the constructed persona. This is also why they often attempt to discredit those who see through them. If someone holds a clear view of their behavior, that person becomes dangerous. The narcissist may smear, minimize, or dismiss them preemptively. Removing the witness restores a sense of safety. Exposure is prevented not by change, but by erasure. In this internal economy, denial and rewriting are not optional behaviors. They are essential survival mechanisms that protect the identity at the expense of reality. When a narcissist sees your pain, they do not interpret it through the lens of harm done or emotional injury caused. Instead, your reaction is translated into evidence of influence. In their internal framework, influence is the primary currency. If you are affected, disturbed, upset, or changed by what they did, it confirms that they occupy a significant position in your psychological world. This confirmation is what they register, not the cost to you. Pain becomes data, not a moral signal. This distortion exists because narcissistic perception is organized around impact rather than empathy. Healthy emotional processing asks, what did this do to the other person? Narcissistic processing asks, what does this say about my power? When you cry, confront, withdraw, or become destabilized, the narcissist does not feel concern. They feel validated. Your pain demonstrates reach. It proves they can alter your internal state. That ability feels stabilizing to someone whose sense of self depends on external response. This is why explaining your hurt rarely produces understanding. The narcissist is listening for indicators of control, not meaning. Your words are scanned for intensity, not content. The more emotionally charged your response, the more significance it holds to them. They may appear attentive, apologetic, or engaged, but the engagement is not with your experience. It is with the confirmation that they matter enough to cause one. The injury itself is secondary to the effect. This dynamic also explains why they often escalate when you show pain. If pain equals influence, then deeper pain equals stronger influence. The narcissist may push further, not because they enjoy suffering in a sadistic sense, but because each reaction reinforces their relevance. Silence, on the other hand, removes feedback. Without feedback, influence cannot be measured. This creates discomfort. They would rather provoke pain than face emotional invisibility. Because pain is interpreted as proof of connection, they may even believe they are justified. In their distorted logic, strong reactions mean the relationship is alive, intense, meaningful. They confuse emotional injury with emotional closeness. This allows them to frame harm as honesty, toughness, or necessary correction. The narrative becomes, if you are hurt, it is because you care, and if you care, I matter. This reasoning bypasses responsibility entirely. This is also why narcissists struggle to understand boundaries. A boundary that causes emotional reaction feels negotiable or attackable. A boundary enforced without emotion feels threatening. Calm detachment offers no evidence of influence, so it is interpreted as rejection or loss of control. That loss triggers attempts to reassert impact, often through criticism, guilt, or sudden displays of charm designed to provoke a response. Over time, this pattern trains the narcissist to seek reactions rather than connection. They become skilled at identifying emotional pressure points because those points produce the clearest feedback. Your pain becomes a mirror that reflects their existence back to them. The tragedy is that this mirror never shows them the damage they cause, only the reassurance that they are still capable of shaping someone else's emotional reality. Silence from you does not register as neutrality to a narcissist. It is interpreted as a destabilizing absence that removes the emotional feedback they rely on to orient themselves. Their sense of self is externally regulated, meaning they need reactions from others to feel real, relevant, and in control. When you stop responding, stop explaining, or stop engaging emotionally, the system they depend on loses input. This absence creates anxiety, not because they miss you in a relational sense, but because the signal they use to measure influence has gone quiet. Narcissists are attuned to response patterns. They monitor tone, timing, and intensity to gauge their position in your psychological space. Silence disrupts this monitoring. Without reaction, they cannot tell if they still matter, still provoke, or still dominate. This uncertainty is deeply uncomfortable. Their internal world does not tolerate ambiguity well. It requires confirmation. When confirmation disappears, the mind begins to fill the gap with threat interpretations. Silence becomes imagined as rejection, detachment, or loss of power. This anxiety often activates a sequence of behaviors designed to restore the feedback loop. They may test the silence with small provocations, indirect comments, or superficial outreach. If that fails, the behavior may escalate into criticism, guilt, or sudden emotional intensity. The goal is not reconciliation, but reaction. Any response, even a negative one, reassures them that they still occupy space in your mind. Engagement confirms existence. Silence also forces the narcissist into unwanted self-contact. Without external distraction, They are left alone with internal sensations they prefer to avoid. Doubt, insecurity, and buried shame begin to surface. These feelings are not processed constructively, but they are felt as agitation or irritability. To escape this state, the narcissist seeks stimulation. Re-engaging you becomes a convenient solution because it restores familiar dynamics where they feel more in control. This is why silence often triggers hoovering behaviors. The narcissist may suddenly appear apologetic, reflective, or affectionate. These displays are not evidence of insight, but tactics to reestablish connection and influence. Once the response returns, the anxiety settles. The internal system stabilizes again. The behavior that caused the silence may never be addressed because addressing it would require accountability, which threatens the identity structure. If silence persists, frustration can turn into resentment. The narcissist may reframe your lack of response as cruelty, immaturity, or manipulation. This reframing protects their ego by assigning fault outward. In their narrative, they are not being ignored because of their actions, but because you are flawed. This allows them to preserve superiority while avoiding self-examination. Ultimately, silence is powerful because it removes the narcissist's primary source of regulation. It interrupts the cycle of reaction and control. While they may outwardly dismiss it or act unaffected, internally it creates instability. They are left without the mirror that reflects their impact. That absence is felt as loss of control, loss of relevance, and loss of certainty, which is why silence often provokes more reaction from them than confrontation ever could. After hurting someone, a narcissist does not sit with the event in a neutral or reflective way. Instead, their mind immediately begins rehearsing justifications. This rehearsal is an internal process designed to protect the self-image from fracture. The narrative is not constructed to understand what happened, but to preserve superiority and innocence. The moment discomfort appears, the psyche searches for explanations that remove responsibility while maintaining control. These justifications often begin as fragments. A single thought such as "they overreacted" or "I had no choice" is enough to interrupt emerging guilt or doubt. Once that interruption occurs, the mind builds outward. Memories are selectively edited. Context is altered. Emphasis is shifted away from the harm and toward provocation, inconvenience, or imagined disrespect. Over time, these fragments are woven into a coherent story that positions the narcissist as reasonable and the other person as flawed. This rehearsal is repeated silently and frequently. The narcissist returns to the event not to examine it, but to strengthen the narrative. Each mental replay reinforces the same conclusion. The more it is repeated, the more convincing it feels. Eventually, the justification is experienced as truth. This is not always conscious deception. It is a psychological adaptation that allows them to function without confronting vulnerability. The need for rehearsal exists because the narcissistic self-image is fragile. It cannot tolerate contradiction. Any unresolved tension threatens collapse. Justifications act like braces holding the structure in place. Without them, the narcissist would be forced to acknowledge limitation, error, or harm, which would destabilize the identity they depend on. The internal dialogue therefore serves as constant maintenance. This process also explains their rigidity in arguments. When confronted, they are not thinking in real time. They are drawing from rehearsed material. Responses may feel repetitive, dismissive, or oddly scripted because they have been practiced internally long before the conversation occurs. The goal is not mutual understanding, but consistency with the internal narrative. Changing the story would require dismantling the entire defensive structure. Rehearsed justifications also blunt emotional impact. By framing the other person as deserving, weak, or unreasonable, the narcissist neutralizes any lingering discomfort. Empathy is replaced with evaluation. The question becomes not, did I hurt them, but were they worthy of consideration? This shift allows the narcissist to maintain emotional distance while preserving self-approval. Over time, these internal rehearsals shape personality. The narcissist becomes more convinced of their own righteousness and less capable of seeing nuance. The mental habit of justification strengthens, making future accountability even less likely. Each incident reinforces the same pattern, creating a closed loop where behavior is defended before it is even examined. From the outside, this can look like stubbornness or dishonesty. Internally, it is an ongoing effort to keep the self intact. The narcissist is not exploring reality, but defending against it. The justifications are not about winning an argument with you, but about winning an argument inside their own mind, where admitting fault would feel like losing everything they believe they are. For a narcissist, admitting fault is not a simple acknowledgement of a mistake. It is experienced as a direct threat to the identity they rely on to function. Their sense of self is built around being right, superior, or exceptional. This identity is not flexible or grounded, it is compensatory. It exists to cover deep insecurity and instability. When fault is admitted, the protective structure weakens, and what it hides risks being exposed. This exposure feels intolerable, which is why admission is avoided at all costs. Accountability requires holding two truths at once, that one has value and that one has caused harm. Healthy psychological structures can integrate this tension. Narcissistic structures cannot. They operate on absolutes. One is either right or wrong, superior or inferior, admired or worthless. There is no middle ground. Admitting fault pushes them into the wrong, inferior category, which feels like annihilation rather than correction. The system reacts as if survival is at stake,